Hi everyone, and welcome to my Rio series presentation. So today I'm going to be presenting to you my a couple of experiments we've conducted at Roehampton looking at combined action observation and motor imagery for self-efficacy and performance enhancement in sport. So as with Owen's talk, this presentation will be focusing on AO+MI, which involves a person observing another person performing, or typically another person performing an action, usually on video, and simultaneously imagining the feelings and sensations involved with performing that action themselves. Now, what we currently know about AO+MI is that it leads to increased and more widespread activity in motor regions of the brain compared to action observation or motor imagery alone. And that AO+MI interventions that are typically delivered over a reasonably long period of time lead to greater performance outcomes across an array of sensory motor and visuomotor tasks compared to interventions that use imagery or observation alone. So we have neurophysiological and behavioural evidence for AO+MI being effective. But what about from a cognitive or a psychological standpoint? Well, the AO+MI literature to date is typically ignored kind of motivational factors or cognitive factors that influence performance of a motor task. And one such factor is self-efficacy, which refers to a situation of task-specific form of confidence and is a strong positive predictor of behaviour across contexts and particularly in sport and exercise. According to Bandura, efficacy beliefs are derived from multiple sources, and the two most prominent of these are mastery and vicarious experiences. Now, from a theoretical standpoint, AO+MI has the capacity to provide both of these sources, namely observing another person performing an action successfully can provide an individual with positive vicarious experiences, and imagining oneself performing an action successfully can provide an individual with reinforcement of positive mastery experiences, and then these two in combination can lead to enhanced efficacy expectations. So the aim of this study and the experiments within this study were to look at shorter term exposure to combined observation and imagery and how that may influence self-efficacy and performance in sport. It was predicted that this would have a positive influence on both variables compared to control conditions, but also potentially compared to observation and imagery conditions in isolation. And I've put an asterisk here to kind of note that typically studies to date have looked at one task based on one set of parameters, and that's not really reflective of sporting performance. So we've manipulated the tasks involved to have some variation within the tasks based on different skill sets or different targets, and that's something that I'll allude to later in the talk. So the first experiment was focused on cricket batting, and we recruited 12 novice cricket batsmen. All of the participants were screened for imagery ability using the VMIQ2 and were demonstrated to be clear and vivid images. And the performance task that we used in this experiment was, like I said, based on cricket batting, but more specifically attacking cricket batting shots. So we used 4 different types of shot. In the first instance, in this clip, you'll see an example of a cut shot. So the ball is delivered short to the offside and cut away. Here you've got a glance shot, so that's a more full delivery to the leg side and glanced in this direction. Then you've got a typical drive shot, so it's a more full delivery to the offside and driven kind of back where it came from. And then you've got a pull shot, which is a full delivery to the, a shorter delivery to the leg side, and it's pulled off the hip and away in this direction. So that's the 4 shots that the participants were being asked to perform, and we were rating their efficacy beliefs based upon. So We adopted a repeated measures experimental design in this study, with each participant engaging in all experimental conditions across the experiment. So we've got 4 conditions: AO+MI, AO, and a control. And they engaged in each of these over relatively short forms. So we took a kind of one session and split it up into essentially quarters, and then delivered the different conditions alongside their performance in those quarters. So first off, people arrived, they were fitted with full kind of cricket batting attire and equipment, and then were run through an investigator-led warm-up, and then were familiarised to the task. So we provided a kind of demonstrations and instructions based on the different shot types, and were then asked to practice each of those 4 times, and that mirrored how many times they would execute them in the performance trials. Then they engaged in the different conditions in the experimental block, and during that, during each condition, they engaged in 16 trials in 4 blocks of 4, relevant to the shot type. So you had 4, in the AO+MI condition, for example, you had 4 AO+MI trials for the cut shot, and then you had 4 performance trials for the cut shot, and then repeated that for the subsequent shot types. And then that was repeated, process was repeated across conditions, with the only thing changing based on the intervention or control videos that were used. As you can see, self-efficacy was measured after each condition, and that was measured using a bespoke 17-item questionnaire that was developed based across all of Bandura's guidelines and all of the competencies of the shots in total. And then we adopted some social validation procedures to gauge their perceived judgments about the conditions and how they influence both self-efficacy and performance. That was a short questionnaire and interview that was to touch on what they thought may have changed and why. So what did we find? Well, based on performance, and that was assessed subjectively, so I haven't actually explained this. So we video recorded their performance in each of those blocks, or each of those conditions, as I've worded them beforehand, and sent that footage to an independent cricket batsman, and essentially asked them to rate, based on a subjective assessment checklist, the quality of the performance in that condition across the different shot types, and that was on a point of 0 to 10. I haven't provided it in the presentation, but I do have it if people want to know more during questions. And you'll see there was an effect for performance. So all 3 simulation conditions, so observation imagery and combined observation imagery, improved performance relative to the control condition, with the performance being at its subjectively best during the AO+MI condition. However, there were no changes for self-efficacy. So you can see here, again, self-efficacy is measured out of 10, and all participants kind of rated themselves fairly highly confident, actually, across all conditions. So that was no main effect of condition there. So that's the findings of and the coverage of experiment 1. In the second experiment, we looked to kind of extend our investigation of this topic by looking at goalkeeper distribution in football and adopting a slightly different study design. So we recruited 32 male recreational footballs this time. So these are people that are familiar with the sport, but are not familiar with the task, so they're not goalkeepers. And they were slightly less clear images, so moderately clear and vivid rather than clear and vivid in the prior study. And the performance task that they were asked to do was based on goalkeeper distribution. So they were doing kicks from hands, something that you wouldn't do in any other position, kicks from floor, which you would do, but maybe not in such a static manner, and throws from hands, which again, you wouldn't do in any other position in football. So things that they won't be hugely familiar with. And as you can see, we varied the kind of scale of the task relative to the task itself. So the kicks from hand were 50 meters, 40 meters for the kicks from floor, and 30 meters for the throw. and the target size also was varied based on kind of expected distribution for that type of task, with performance being measured based on the central point anyway. So this was just something for them to aim for, which was painted on the turf by the groundskeeper, happily. And in this design, we used a mixed experimental design. So people were allocated to one of the 4 conditions rather than actually taking part in all of them. Again, they took part in a typical warm-up and familiarization, and then were tested at pre-test and post-test either side of the intervention. Now, during the experimental block, if we look here in the intervention block, each participant completed their respective intervention, a total of about 30 trials. That was split into 6 blocks of 5, and those 6 blocks of 5 were based on the variations of the task. So each task to the left and right target. So essentially, they had 5 trials per specific variation of the task, and after each 5 trials, they then performed 5 practice trials. So this was integrated with practice of the task, as opposed to performance of the task in experiment 1. Task performance was recorded pre and post, and that was 30 trials, so matched onto the actual intervention kind of amount of practice trials that were included. So again, it's 5 trials for each of the variations of the tasks. And self-efficacy was measured before and after the physical test at pre and post. So a 24-item measure was developed that tapped into the different competencies of the tasks, and that was given before and after the test phase. So 4 times in total, and aggregated at pre and post test. So the study findings for experiment 2 showed an interaction between the condition and test phase, and pairwise comparisons reported kind of improved performance, which is a reduction in mean radial error for all 3 simulation interventions, with the greatest improvement being there for combined observation and imagery. And then the same was evident for self-efficacy. So again, an interaction effect was present, and self-efficacy was increased for all 3 simulation conditions, with the greatest increase for combined observation and imagery. So what does our study show? Well, we think it provides further support for the performance enhancing effects of AO+MI. Obviously, we've delivered the intervention in 2 different ways, and also slightly differently to existing studies with a kind of greater brevity. But we've provided further support because we've used different kind of skill classifications, different sports, and also different measures of performance. So additional support is provided, but I do note that in both studies, observation and imagery had significant effects as well, maybe not to the same extent based on descriptors, but also significant effects. So something to consider is when do these interventions kind of do separate out across time. In terms of self-efficacy, we showed that there was an improvement in self-efficacy for AO+MI in the second study over a greater exposure to observation imagery, but not in the first study. And that's maybe based on the designs of the study, where we can really kind of tease that out with a mixed design, but it might cross over based on the randomization and counterbalancement in the repeated measures design. But it also may allude to the fact that self-efficacy is a developmental process, and thus maybe performance precedes self-efficacy, and therefore could be something that influenced the findings of both studies. And then finally, we want to make some suggestions for future research, and those are based on, I guess, the ecological kind of validity or ecological approach used in sport-based research on this topic. We tried to kind of mirror some aspects of sporting performance, not to the full extent, but to at least some extent, to see if these things work in a more real-world setting. especially regarding kind of how much of the intervention is delivered. You don't get afforded a huge amount of time in sport, especially high performance sports. So it's something that warrants kind of further exploration. And we think kind of aspects of intervention delivery, what tasks are and how you measure performance, and also kind of the representative nature of the tasks to overall performance in that sport should be considered in future research. Thanks very much for listening. Obviously, any questions are welcome.